Welcome to the Buck Stops here, the official audio show of NotInHallOfFame.com, and I'm your host, Kirk Buckner, the owner and the operator of NotInHallOfFame.com and the sister sites, the fictitious Athlete Hall of Fame, the fictitious Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and the now up and atom United States Athletic Hall of Fame. If you haven't checked that out, please do. If you're a regular listener and follower of the show that Evan Nolan and I do, the weekly Hall of Fame show, you may remember that the WWE really screwed up when it came to their Hall of Fame class. They were lazy, they were late, they took so much time to put everything out to the point where it just felt that they were unprepared. And it didn't just feel like they were unprepared, they were clearly unprepared. They got a lot of flack, and deservedly so, when one of their Legacy Wing inductions, Ethel Johnson, one of the first African-American women in wrestling, was chosen for that. They announced it the day or during the ceremony, and during the footage, they used the wrong person. Not only did they use the wrong wrestler, the person in question who they used wrestled 20 years after Ethel Johnson debuted. So as all this was sort of coming down the pipeline in the internet wrestling community, Chris Bournea, who did this wonderful documentary that we're going to be talking about, Lady Wrestler, and he's going to tell you how you can watch that, had a great interview with the family of Ethel Johnson. And I reached out to Chris to talk to him about his documentary about Ethel Johnson, why she is this amazing pioneer in the world of wrestling, and just in general. I think it's a great interview. I'm a little biased. I did it. So without further ado, let's bring in Chris, and I hope you enjoy the show. Chris, thank you so much for being a part of this show. I have been wanting to talk to you almost instantly as soon as everything broke out after the WWE Hall of Fame. I almost want to call it a fiasco, but it was certainly an error in what happened to the legacy of Ethel Johnson.
Yeah, thanks, Kirk, for having me on. And I think the family of Ethel Johnson just want to see her legacy recognized properly. Like me, I don't want to speak for the family. I'm not their, official spokesperson or anything like that. But I think they were pleased to see that Ethel received the recognition. They just wanted it to be done in a way that really honored her legacy in the right way.
Now, you've got a documentary that came out, I think, a couple months ago, but it was you did it a few years ago, I believe. Lady Wrestler, the untold story of African-American women in the business. And I learned so much from it. This is, I'll admit, a blind spot for me in terms of my own wrestling fandom. I grew up in the 80s in Canada. And basically that's sort of like WWF country at the time. So I never really went back to do sort of research on wrestlers, be it male or female, before that time. And whenever I do learn anything, it's usually on other podcasts, like maybe from Jim Cornette or Dave Meltzer or people of that ilk. So learning about Ethel was such an eye-opener to me. When did you first become enamored with doing her story? And that of other wrestlers. It's not just her, obviously.
Yeah, well, it's interesting you say it was a blind spot for you because it was a blind spot for me. And I'm African-American like Ethel, and I grew up in the same town where her and her sisters and the other African-American women and other women, period, who were the pioneers of women's wrestling, where their headquarters was. So, if it was underground for me, and I'm in the place where it all started and went on for decades, no wonder it was underground for you, being in another country. But how I became aware of Ethel's story is that most of my career has been in print journalism. I've always had ambitions to be a filmmaker, but I didn't actually. So Lady Wrestler is my first feature-length film. I'd done some shorts and some small things before that in film, but this is my first foray into making an actual feature-length documentary or narrative film, for that matter. So back in 2005, when I was working full-time at a newspaper called This Week, which is a community newspaper owned by the local daily newspaper here in Columbus, Ohio, the Columbus Dispatch, I would frequently call a man who works in public relations, another African-American man named Terry Anderson. And oftentimes when I called Terry, he would say, there's this really interesting lady that you should interview. So Terry ended up setting up an interview with me and Ethel Johnson toward the end of 2005. And when I met Ethel. I just thought her story was just amazing. I mean, she talked about going all over the world in the 50s, 60s, and 70s as a teenager and, 20-something and 30-something young woman, and going, all over, like Canada. Montreal was a place that she went to train and wrestle often, all over the United States, and places like, all throughout Latin America, Mexico, Cuba, before the United States put the embargo in, even as far away as Australia and Japan. But then when she would wrestle in the Deep South here in the United States, she was subjected to the same Jim Crow laws that all African Americans were subjected to, meaning she'd have to stay in segregated hotels, she'd have to eat at segregated restaurants, or go in the back door of the restaurant, get her food directly from the kitchen, and if she happened to be, out about in town before or after a wrestling match, she'd have to step off the sidewalk if a white person was approaching her. She says a lot of this in the documentary. Mm-hmm. So I wrote Ethel's story up for the Columbus Dispatch, the local daily newspaper, and it came out in March of 2006 in time for Women's History Month. And it happened to come out the same weekend that Arnold Schwarzenegger, the movie star and the famous bodybuilder, holds an annual fitness festival in Columbus. So Arnold Schwarzenegger's people saw the article and called me at the newspaper and said, "Hey, we'd love to honor Ethel Johnson with a Lifetime Achievement Award." And so, believe it or not, Ethel was always kind of a shy person. She was always very dynamic in the ring, but anyone who sees the documentary will find out that she made a very conscious effort to keep her personal life and her professional life separate. She didn't even tell her children she was a wrestler. So by the time I interviewed her, Ethel had been retired since the late 70s, and she was sort of talking to me sort of like out of a favor to her daughter, Shelley, Shelley Adams, who'd been trying to get Ethel's story kind of documented just so people would know about it, just for people to know about her accomplishments, for future generations to kind of know about her mother. So when I ran the idea by I called her Miss Ethel, out of respect, her being my elder. When I ran the idea by Miss Ethel, she basically said, "Tell them I said thanks, but no thanks." So I just thought, if an internationally recognized person like Arnold Schwarzenegger, who's not only successful in fitness, but, hugely, phenomenally successful in the movie business, sees the value in Ethel's story, then there's obviously something more to it than just one newspaper article. And in my research for researching the article about Ethel, I'd come across a documentary about women wrestlers from Ethel's era called Lipstick and Dynamite. Mm-hmm. And that movie was great. I consider, Lady Wrestler to sort of be a compliment to Lipstick and Dynamite, but Lipstick and Dynamite didn't have interviews with Ethel or any of the other black women. So I just thought, if anyone deserves their own movie, it's these black women who not only dealt with sexism in the industry, but racism, not only in the industry, but in the world at large. And so I just asked Miss Ethel, I said, would you, I said, your story is very, very compelling. Would you be open to being interviewed on camera? And thankfully she said yes. And so that led me to find other women, like, first of all, Ethel's older sister, Babs Wingo, and her younger sister, Marva Scott, were also wrestling legends in their own right, but they had both passed away. Both Babs and Marva had passed away in 2003. So, of course, I didn't get a chance to interview them, but I spoke to their children. I spoke to Marva Scott's children. I actually was not in touch with Babs Wingo's children, but I've since been in touch with them. And I also got to interview Ramona Isbell, another African-American female wrestler who retired, who lives in Columbus. And in the course of my research, just found out there were dozens of these, not only African-American women, but just dozens of women wrestlers who had been recruited by a promoter named Billy Wolf back in the, Billy Wolf actually started his wrestling organization in Columbus in the 30s, starting up, he helped launch what was known as the golden age of women's wrestling from the 30s through the 50s. So the African-American women, like Ethel and Babs and Marva and Ramona, came in at the tail end of what they call the golden age in the early 50s. So I just thought it was an amazing story, no pun intended, referred to the title of the documentary. And I just thought Ethel's stories and the stories of women like Ramona and other women were just invaluable and should just be, documented. So that's what was the genesis of the documentary.
Now, with Ethel being inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame, that certainly has brought a lot more attention to her story and to others. And watching the interview that you did with the family after, and you could just feel the pain that they had, not because she was inducted, it was just because they didn't contact anyone in the family. B, they used footage from a completely different African-American woman who, also doesn't even look like Ethel, and is from a completely different era.
Yeah, and I think what the family was so upset about was, number one, there were multiple ways for the WWE to contact them. I mean, it's a tremendous honor, but I don't know what the WWE's process is for inducting wrestlers into their other industry figures into their Legends Hall of Fame. I don't know if with everyone they don't make any attempt to contact the family. That's something I'm not privy to at all, because number one, neither myself nor did anyone in the family campaign for Ethel. Like how people campaign for Oscars. Well, I don't know if you do know that, but filmmakers and actresses and studios often launch Oscar campaigns, where they take out ads and they contact the Academy and say, for your consideration, here's my work. Please nominate me for Best Actress or Best Director or Best Picture or whatever. None of that campaigning took place. So it wasn't even on anyone's mind. Although occasionally over the years, people would say to me, "Oh, this is a really interesting story. You should contact the WWE." But it's just something that I didn't really, think of or pursue. So it came as a total surprise. And the way both myself and the family found out about it was through social media, like through wrestling fans, tagging us on Twitter or Facebook. And I think, so it's not that the WWE needed to contact me. It was just Ethel was written up in a very, very lengthy obituary about a year after she passed away in 2018 in the New York Times. So the WWE, if they were trying to find accurate photos or footage of Ethel, which they could have gotten from either me or the family, they could have contacted the New York Times and said, "Hey, I see Ethel's daughter Shelley is quoted in this article. How can we get in touch with her?" They could have contacted me. I'm all over social media. The Lady Wrestler documentary has a website, LadyWrestlerMovie.com. They could have contacted a local history organization here in Columbus called the Ohio History Connection that right before the pandemic held a huge, huge exhibit on the history of sports in Ohio and included women's wrestling in it. So there were multiple ways for the WWE to get, accurate footage of and photos of Ethel. And they could have also contacted the University of Notre Dame, which has a huge wrestling archive, and which is where I found a lot of the archival material that I featured in the documentary. So there were numerous ways for the WWE to contact the family and to find accurate photos and footage of Ethel that actually had Ethel's name on it. So you would know, okay, this is Ethel Johnson, not her older sister Babs, which they used the picture of her older sister Babs. And this is Ethel wrestling, not Sandy Parker. They used, footage of Sandy Parker in the ring, and Sandy Parker came in the business years after Ethel did. So I think that was the puzzling thing about it is, even if they weren't going to contact the family, even if that's not a customary thing they do with their induction, why not at least go through some channels to do some kind of verification or fact checking that this was indeed photos and footage of the woman you're inducting. That just kind of boggles the mind with an organization that's as huge as the WWE, and has, you would think vast resources to do something like that.
I'm guessing, and again, I don't know for sure, but the whole ceremony this year, and maybe the pandemic had something to do with it. I really don't see how, because you still have weeks to prepare. You've already made a decision that you're going to do your ceremony virtually. Yeah. But this year, it seemed they staggered their induction announcements so late. Okay. So even for the regular class, they didn't make any announcement until 3 weeks before. In prior years, they would announce it on their flagship show on Mondays, one announcement and then another and then another. This one was just it's like they decided everything last minute. And even with the legacy wing, they'd at least made announcements the week before or leading up to it, not during the actual event. So I wonder if when they decided this, whoever put the footage together had so little time. Because clearly there was no checks and balance. I don't know. This is just a theory on my part.
Uh-huh. Well, yeah, that's a good point. And as a journalist, especially somebody who's worked for, small weekly newspapers for a lot of my career, you are always under deadline pressure. And you often find yourself putting things together at the last minute. Like, a lot of my career has been, covering like city council meetings where you have to boil down these very complex pieces of legislation and get all the details right, and then, send it in within hours of when the meeting, concludes. So that's not anything that has, that is without outside of the realm of possibility of, anybody who works in journalism or anybody who works in broadcast news can tell you, we are under constant deadline pressure, and sometimes we make mistakes and have to go back and issue corrections. That's perfectly understandable because we're all human. We all make mistakes. What I think the family was upset about is even when Shelley, Ethel's eldest daughter, contacted the WWE and said, hey, you used the wrong photo and the wrong footage, and they assured her that it would be corrected. I don't, to my knowledge, they never followed up with her. Somebody called Shelley and said, oh, it's been corrected, but they didn't, give her a link to the corrected footage or, how newspapers will frequently post a correction saying, such and such photo that we ran was actually of so-and-so. Here's the correct photo. Accidents and mistakes do happen, especially when you're under a tight deadline. But again, small community newspapers manage to make corrections.
Mm-hmm.
Large newspapers like the New York Times run corrections. CNN runs corrections. There's nobody who's under constant deadline pressure, who hasn't made some kind of error. But it's not that difficult to, correct an error like that. You just simply, ask the person who brought the error to your attention to please help them make the correction, and then, you correct it and move on. It's not rocket science.
Mm-hmm. Now, currently the WWE does have a lot of African-American female wrestlers. One of their champions is right now in Bianca Belair.
Uh-huh.
Have any of the African-American wrestlers, male or female, sort of reached out to sort of learn more about this history that they might not have been aware of either?
I don't know if they've reached out to the family. I'm sure the family told me because we've been in constant contact. If they said, hey, Bianca Belair contacted us. There have been a couple that have tagged me. Either they've tagged me in social media or someone else has said, hey, and I'm sorry, I don't remember the names. It was maybe one or two, but it wasn't. But I personally have not been contacted by any of the Africans directly, I should say.
Mm-hmm.
There's been a couple of independent wrestlers who contacted me and said, oh, I'd like to know more about the documentary, or, I'd like to interview you, for the podcast I have or whatever sometime. But none of the well-known marquee African-American female wrestlers have reached out. And, maybe they've because the documentary is on Amazon, maybe they went and watched the documentary, because I have no way of knowing, because Amazon doesn't disclose people's, identities to me when people buy or rent the movie. So it's possible they did go watch the documentary, but they haven't, made any public statement about, oh, I'm so inspired by knowing about Ethel Johnson, or I'm so inspired by, what Ramona Isbell said about, triumphing over racism back when she was wrestling in the 60s. So no, there hasn't been none of the African that I know of, none of the well-known African-American female wrestlers have made a huge public statement about the women who came before them.
What's next for you? What's your next big project?
So interestingly enough, I filmed another feature-length movie in the summer of 2019 called Things Are Tough All Over. And I've just kind of been so busy distributing and promoting Lady Wrestler that I haven't had a chance to really finish post-production on this movie. And it's actually set during the Great Recession of 2008. It's called Things Are Tough All Over, about a black family struggling through that, through the, foreclosure crisis. And what's really weird, it has these strange parallels to the pandemic, because both parents lose their job, and because they no longer have the income to send their kids to private school and don't want their kids to go to the neighborhood school that's kind of failing, they end up having to homeschool their children. So the husband and wife are like home all day with their kids, driving each other crazy. So it's really odd that it's just like, I shot this movie right before the pandemic started, and it was like art imitating life.
Everything does seem to be cyclical, doesn't it?
Yeah, it really. And you know what? An aside that's really strange is, I'd had that title, Things Are Tough All Over, in my head for like years and years and years. And then one day I was kind of randomly browsing Amazon, and there's a Cheech and Chong movie from the 80s called Things Are Tough All Over. And coincidentally, it's also set in Chicago, like my movie is. But I would have been like 9 or 10 years old when this movie was released. So I don't think my parents let me watch a Cheech and Chong movie that inspired this movie I made. But it's, who knows? It's possible I saw it on like cable and got inspired by it somehow. But yeah, that's just another strange little coincidence.
I have to say, I don't know that I've ever come across anything where people said they like Cheech and Chong, but I never heard them being cited as inspirational before.
Exactly.
Not that they'd remember if you told them. But
yeah. Yeah, exactly.
All right. Well, this is. Thank you so much for all of that, for being on this. And where can people find Lady Wrestler?
Yeah, so there's the website, LadyWrestlerMovie.com. There's the Lady Wrestler Facebook page, which is Facebook.com/LadyWrestlerMovie. And then, anyone can reach out to me personally. I'm at Chris Bournea, Bournea, writer, like, author, WRITER, on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. And I think on Twitter, it's just Chris Bournea, at Chris Bournea.
Okay. Thank you so much, and hopefully we'll be able to chat again. I'd love to learn more about the next project when that comes out.
Thank you, Kirk. I really appreciate it.
All right, thanks. Thank you so much for listening. We're going to have a lot more content coming from us at NotInHallOfFame.com. Stay safe, everyone.